Okay, díomh gachaine fáilte leis ríis die trasna na tíre, ha mí an seo ríis le haig léocht an céad sco eile le Rosaleen Durkin an dobar néfa nó an tobar banathe. So há chumach going stocha na tobar néfs na tobar banathe há scapar fudfad na tíre in gachi le cúna den tíre seo. Ach Doríra an bhfuil an tólas fada going faoin na háit na speisialta seo, nó bhfuil si go léir drúta going, nó bhfuil si just churthair le taobh going. So tonight we have another fantastic lecture from Rosaleen Durkin here tonight about the Holy Well. And I suppose in terms of the Holy Wells, we're all aware of them. We know that they're there. But in terms of the actual significance of the Holy Well and the story, not only in the locality, but as in terms of them being spread across the countryside, do we actually have the entire picture? And so many of these have been forgotten and just left to be overgrown through the years. And Rosaleen, I was talking to you there yesterday, and you were telling me that the perception of the Holy Well in Ireland is something that I suppose as Irish people we're aware of them being there, but really the story behind them, not many of us actually are sure exactly of what the origin of the Holy Well is.
Yes, yeah, and that's why in the talk that I'm going to do now, I want to do it more not just as historical information. I actually want to do it as more the overall story of what happened with the wells, but going way back in history as well. So what I will do is I'll actually share the screen so we can start. Okay, so now can you see the screen okay there?
Perfectly. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is, first of all, Ben, I'd like to thank you for helping me with all my Zoom technology, because I've actually, this is my first Zoom talk, so I've got my head around it, but it's a little bit different because all the other talks I've done were live talks, so I have to just get into the feeling of how it works. So what I'm going to cover is basically, a lot of people ask me, well, why are you actually doing the work you're doing, or why are you interested in wells? So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk about the work that we're doing in Wicklow, which is a group called Wicklow Wells. I'll also talk about, well, what is a holy well? What are the traditions worldwide? What are the rituals, the cures, the traditions and the folklore? And then instead of probably just boring you all with pictures of 20 or 30 wells in Wicklow, I'm going to actually give you a story of one well that was probably over 5 or 6 years of work that we were doing with it, but also just to show the process of what actually has to be done with each well that we're actually working on. And then the last thing I'll talk about is basically the future of wells, as in what we're actually planning to do in the future. Now I'm just going to go to my first slide. Okay, so in terms of my interest in wells, it was something that I didn't make a conscious choice to actually do it. It just kind of happened because of things that I was interested in. So I'm interested in folklore, I'm interested in photography, I'm interested in nature, I'm interested in probably a lot of traditions, but probably the main thing that probably attracted me to studying the wells was actually the people and the stories. So if you go back in time, it was the stories of the people and it was the stories of the landscape. So I grew up in County Mayo in the 1960s, and I've only been reflecting on this while I was doing the talk. Was I grew up surrounded by folklore, surrounded by nature, surrounded by landscape, listening to older people telling ghost stories and superstitions and all the traditions. And when I'm listening to Michael Fortune, I'm realizing I'm actually very lucky because I listened to a lot of that when I was actually growing up, and it was in my bones, and then I probably forgot about it, or when you're a child, you don't take it very seriously. It's not really that important. And then as I got older, I realized, well, it is actually really important. So a lot of what I'm doing in Wicklow is probably going back to a lot of things that I learned when I was a child. So in terms of I blame this rag tree in Kilkenny for sparking an interest in, I think it was in 2007. I was going to a conference, a work conference in Kilkenny, and on the way to the conference I passed by this tree. It's a rag tree now, it doesn't have a well beside it. But after the conference I was so interested, I thought, I'm driving back out the road to take some pictures of this tree. And when I was taking the pictures, the bit that struck me was that every single piece of cloth on that rag tree is a story belonging to a person with a problem, or it could be a thank you for something, or a prayer for somebody who was sick. So that basically captured my interest a little bit, and that's another picture of the rag tree there. So I kind of forgot about it, but I did Google at the time, well, rag trees, and what I found out was that the rag tree tradition is all over the world, but it's one of the main countries is in Ireland, but that it was actually associated with Holy Wells. So that's probably where part of my interest in the Holy Wells started at the very beginning. And then I'll just give you just a very general definition of what a Holy Well is. And then you can see, as Ben was saying, it's a lot of this stuff I had to learn the more we were working on the wells, because I wasn't aware of it either. So a holy well may be broadly defined as a location where water issues from the earth and where the site is or has been a focal point for supernatural divination, the curing of illness through ritual, the cursing of third parties, and or the veneration of early Christian saints, pagan deities, or elements of nature, specifically the water itself. So if you're looking at that from stories, there's a lot of stories in there. And I think this is part of the reason that there's probably some confusion in Ireland to do with the wells, because we're not aware of how far back they go and what the actual stories are. And known in Irish as Tober Baniha, literally holy well, or Tober Nifa, literally saintly well, the locations of many of these sites are within areas of natural beauty, often in groves of trees, hollows in the landscape, the edge of waysides, or at points where borders and boundaries run or meet. Others are located hidden in darkness in mysterious underground tunnels, chambers or caves, and others at the edge of the sea. Often they're situated in close proximity to megaliths of varying types, to religious houses or settlements, and to Killini, burial grounds for unbaptized babies. So in 2013, when I was visiting my family in Mayo, I started to look at some of the holy wells there. And one of the things that I'm still so glad I did was I interviewed this lady, Delia Henry, who was 102 when I actually did a short video of her talking about the wells, and she passed away at 104. But her mind was totally clear. So when she was talking about history, it was living history to her. She's talking about her memories of what happened at the well in 1916 was her first memories of the well. So I then realized that if, in a way, if something isn't done with recording or documenting the older people, a lot of the information about the wells is going to be lost, because nobody will actually remember the stories. So this was the well in Mayo near Charlestown, which Delia Henry was talking about. That was in 1954. So that would have been a pattern day. There would have been games, music, dancing. There was a mass. There was lots and lots of different events. And then when I went to visit it in 2013, unfortunately, I would say very, very, very few people go there. But you can see the well is there, is covered and is kept very clean, and then the offerings are there. And so it's all sitting there. So again, these are the kind of places that have potential to be cleaned up and tidied up once the landowners are okay with it. So what I'm going to talk about now is basically the worldwide situation with holy wells and water worship. So They were for curative and spiritual reputations are found among many cultures from Europe to Asia and America. Water worship was in many of the ancient civilizations, including Egypt, Greece, Troy, Babylon, and ancient Rome. So if you're looking at where they're located, they're everywhere. But the bit that's very interesting is worldwide, Ireland's got the highest number in that in the as a country. So in the 1980s, there were over 3,000 holy wells documented in Ireland on the old maps. So it's very, very important. Now, it's a very good book written on the holy wells of Dublin by Gary Brannigan. And Gary has been involved with some of the wells we've been working on in Wicklow as well. Then you've got the Living Wells of Wales by Phil Cope. And again, I love the word the living wells, because when people are talking about wells, a lot of people think, oh, they're old and nobody goes there and they don't really exist, or they're not alive. But from what I'm seeing in the work we are doing, they are actually still alive. Now, some of them are forgotten about and need to be revived, but a lot of them are living, and people still do go there, and people still do look after them. This is one in Brittany. And then the Vikings, I was doing a bit of research on this. The Vikings believed that the healing in spring water came from Odin or from Thor. So it came from the gods. And then this is also very interesting. It's an offering site in Finnmark in North Norway, in a Sami area. And the Sami people, they would have had stories where offerings were given to, for offerings for fishing. They would throw an offering into a lake or into a river. And then the offering sites were actually the same thing, that you brought an offering to an offering site. And what I learned as well from traveling was that there was a lot of the traditions got suppressed by the church. So, for example, this Sami site, the Sami people were told, you don't go there because the devil is at the offering site. So this, again, instilled fear into going to some of these places. And then there were other things, which I'll talk about later in Ireland, to do with both political and religious things that prevented people going to the wells. And I think that's part of where people can actually get confused. And then this is also an offering stone, which is again in the Sami area and the north of Norway. And we went to visit that. And probably very few people go there, but that would have been similar to going to a holy well. And then in Sweden, these are two people that I met when I was traveling in Sweden, and they have Trays and Lotta. They have a well in the west of Sweden in Huseby that is an Irish St. Bridget's well. And they have a festival every 1st of February where they have a gathering and people come there and they walk barefoot in the water, in the snow, which I've been there a couple of times and it's really, really beautiful. But also they see Irish Bridget as the protector of blacksmiths, and the woman on the left, Trace, is actually a blacksmith. So she blesses her tools when she's doing competitions with water from the Bridget well. And that is them doing their ritual. Now, again, I found, because I like traveling and because I've gone particularly to Sweden and Norway, it made me look at the Irish wells in a different way, because I won't say I didn't see them as very important, but I didn't fully understand the story of the whole pre-Christian, Christian, and the whole story right through. Whereas when I went away and saw this is actually the influence of Ireland on Sweden, and also that would have been where the missionaries sailed up the coast to Sweden. And there's also an Irish Bridget's well in Iceland. And this is a well called Jacob's Well in the West Bank in Palestine. And this would have been followed by Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions. And that's a picture of the well, I think in 1860, where just people who were resting or traveling would have sat at the well. So if we're looking at all traditions, I mean, the American Indian, Native American people believe that water is life and water is really, really important. The Aboriginal people would have all their traditions to do with water as well. And you're looking at water and wells and the influence in poetry. Rumi, he was the famous Persian poet. He says, "Keep digging your well, the water is there somewhere. Not only the thirsty seek the water as well seeks the thirsty." And then we've got our own John O'Donoghue. "Let us bless the grace of water, the well whose liquid root worked through the long night of clay, flowing crystal clear and free through delighted emptiness." And then this book I read recently by a woman called Sharon Blackie, who she's just moved back to Wales, but she had been living in Ireland. And again, if we're looking at water, she says, "Even those of us who take for granted a constant supply of piped water into our homes, nevertheless understand the value of a good well. It is in our folk memory. A good well never runs dry. You can always depend on it. And water is the source of life. But the source of life, like all things, must be cared for. A good well must be tended." So again, this was seen, if we go back before we could just turn on the water in our taps, a well had to be looked after because it was actually the only supply of water that people had. And then this was actually last week, and I was passing by one of the wells on my way to the shops in Wicklow, and I just called into Trinity Well in Ashford just to tidy it up a little bit and see if anything needed to be done. And these pictures actually really helped me because they're helping me to see it's a living tradition, and the offerings on the tree a lot of them were new offerings that it was, I would know which offerings were new, which ones were old. So if you look at those offerings, the ones that are tied with string beside the smiley face, some of those things could be hanging there for 20, 30 years. Whereas this one was what really caught my attention to do with the coronavirus. There's plastic gloves and there's a belt, like a dressing gown belt, and there's a rosary beads. So there's a mixture of all different traditions in there, but that could quite easily be a belt belonged to somebody who may have coronavirus or who's sick. I don't know the full story, but again, it's showing that the wells are now fully interwoven in with lots and lots of different traditions. So if you're looking at that, you've got the gloves and you've also got a Bridges cross on the tree. And then you've got your rosary beads. Now, I think part of the reason that the offerings were there was because of May Day as well. So the rosary beads would have a medal of Mary on it, which again would be linked in with Mary and the month of May. And then we've got a dream catcher. So again, what has happened is the wells are now reflecting the story of people in their day-to-day lives.
And when you speak of Rosaleen, you know, I suppose in terms of the international focus and the traveling that you've done and all the wells that you've seen, how did the Wicklow Wells group come about? Was that before this or after?
To be honest, the Wicklow Wells was before that. And how Wicklow Wells started was in 2013, I had just moved to Glendalough a couple of years ago in Wicklow, and a group of us were running, it was a midsummer festival, and somebody said to me, well, can you research the traditions of midsummer? And what I found was one of the traditions of midsummer was to go to a well and clean a well and give thanks for clean water. And at that time, I remember thinking, well, that's just as relevant now as it was way back to give thanks for clean water. So And then I did a little talk at St. Kevin's Well in Glendalough as part of the festival. So I had to look up the traditions and, you know, the different things that people did at Holy Well. So that probably got me a little bit interested. And then there was 4 of us then decided we would look at how many other Holy Wells there were in Wicklow. And like any good idea, it sounded like a really good idea at the time, but we had no idea of, number 1, how many there were, number 2, how long it would actually take, because when we set up Wicklow Wells, it's an informal group. It was set up, you know, 3 or 4 of us, we live locally, and we were just seeing it as something to do on a Sunday and go for coffee and then look for a well and see if we can find out, talk to the older people. But when we started to study it, there's probably 130 Holy Wells in Wicklow. So it's not just a case of you look at the map and you go out and the well is there. You can actually go out and there's nothing, or there's a house built on top of it, or you have to find out where the local people are and all the different things. So our goal was really to, probably what I said at the beginning was that if we weren't going to do it, a certain amount of, number 1, the wells would be lost, and number 2, the information about the wells would be lost, and the older people would have died, because they're the ones, a lot of the older people are the ones holding the stories. And then the other thing we looked at was, well, which ones are public access and which ones are private access? Because from the very beginning, we've been very clear, if the wells are on private land, it's 100% up to those people what they do with the well. And we don't, even if we document it, we don't put it on maps, or we don't say it's public access, because people are dealing with insurance problems and, you know, access to their privacy and things like that. And then we also, as we went on, then we were working with marker stones in Irish and English, and information plaques in Irish and English, and then signs, you know, road signs where they are, and then things like talks to groups and talks to schools, and also organized walks. So if I'm going back again in time to do with, the more I researched it, in terms of going back in time, I had to look at, okay, but what, if I can go way back in Ireland, what is the information that I can actually find about these wells? So this photograph I got is from 1860, and it's an elderly lady at Dunes Well, which is in Donegal. So again, if we're looking at stories, I mean, our ancestors did not have it easy. I mean, that would have been just after the famine. There would have been a lot of problems. People went to the wells with their problems. And then if you look behind the woman, there's actually offerings that would have been probably put on little trees or something near the well. This one is in Ardmore in Waterford. And again, if you look at it, they're in bare feet. And they're again going to the well for help with whatever the problems are. And those photographs I got from the Durkin collection. And then it's also it's Old Ireland in Colour. It's a group on Facebook that actually is putting colour into the old photographs. So what I was trying to do was see that the past and the present are incredibly linked, because it's the same stories in a different environment. Okay, so if you go back in time, people had, after the famine or in 1798, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, or war times, people were dealing with a lot of very, very difficult things. But then if you look at life today, people are also dealing with very difficult things in a different environment. I mean, we're not starving with hunger, but we have other problems that are going on in the world that are also quite serious. So it's seen that wells can be a place for anybody who just wants to find a nice place to go and reflect. And this was a man I interviewed, he's a priest in Mayo, and he said, as a child back in the 1940s, the pattern in Temple, which was the pictures I showed earlier, as a unique occasion in our locality. Times were tough and made much tougher by the war in Europe. Yet in rural Ireland, we enjoyed a great peace. From one point of view, they were the worst of times, but it was days like the pattern in Temple that enable many of us to look back and remember them as the best of times. And this would be somebody who grew up in the 1940s. And then, so this is actually a few years ago at St. Kevin's Well in Glendalough. So again, it's looking at people are still interested in this and they want to know a little bit more about the stories. And one of the key things I've tried to do with the work I'm doing is to actually get children involved, because if the children connect with it as children, they actually will remember. And this was children from the school in Moneystown, where they brought stones. Every family brought a stone and left it at the well as part of one of the walks that we did. And then children can often see more the magic in it, like making wishes or, you know, throwing flowers into the well. That would have been all part of it. So these would be more current quotes. I left the well feeling refreshed and renewed. And this is actually a friend of mine, Charlene, who has brought groups to Ireland. I've worked with them, bringing them to wells and mountains and different places. And again, what I found really interesting is that people from outside Ireland see the wells in a totally different perception than we do in Ireland, and they probably see them as more important because, again, I think they're not carrying the history and the story. So I think it's also important that Irish people probably look at it maybe with different eyes once you fully know the full story. And then the second quote I have there is from Margaret Connolly, who's a local historian, which was one of the wells that had fully disappeared, which is now back as a Heritage Week event. And she wrote, "I always love going to visit Lady's Well. There is something very healing, calming and spiritual about the place. It is difficult to believe that until a few years ago, it was not visible at all and its existence had faded from local memory. It now feels like it has always been there, open and visible and visited. When I sit there, I feel like I'm connecting with my own people who would probably have visited there regularly as they went about their daily lives."
And when you speak of that, just that quote there at the top of feeling refreshed and renewed, even listening to the likes of Eddie, who spoke a few days ago, in terms of like the cures and folklore and all of that stuff that surrounds these wells, does that all stem from that just initial feeling that people had, as in when they leave the well, that this feeling of being refreshed and renewed somehow strengthened the belief that there was a cure or something associated with that place?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'll actually talk about in terms of the places being sacred, and then I'll talk about the cures. So what happened was, going back, the wells would have been seen as some place sacred. And then there was also a ritual. So when you went to the sacred place, there was a ritual of some kind, like you left an offering or you drank a little bit of the water. So there was always a ritual associated with it. And then to do with it, a lot of them were on pilgrim routes. So to do with a place of pilgrimage is a walk to somewhere sacred. So that doesn't matter what the place is. It just means that it's important to you. So say, for example, with what we're dealing with now, for anybody who has access to nature, you know, if you go walking to somewhere that's very important to you and you sit there for a little while, you do feel better. So that actually is a pilgrimage, and that is a sacred place, because it doesn't have to be a well. It's like everywhere is sacred. But in terms of historically, these places were considered very sacred, because when you sit in some of these places, you're connecting with yourself, you're connecting with the landscape, and you're connecting with spirituality. And then it's a two-way engagement. So you're connecting with the well, but the well is actually connecting with you. So in terms of the cures and the traditions, so there was things like certain wells were supposed to have certain cures for different things. So one well could have a cure for skin problems, another well could be a cure for depression, another well might have a cure for colds, another for headaches, lots and lots of different things. So, but there has been some research done as well that the minerals in the water could also have helped. So say, for example, there's one well we looked at, St. Colin Kills well, and the man we spoke to said a lot of people went there for dermatitis problems in their skin. But sometimes wells that have a lot of silica can actually heal the skin. Or you could have there's a well in Kerry, I think, that has lithium. I don't know, they haven't measured the exact amounts, but over the years, a lot of people, it was called Turban and Out, the Well of Madness, and people went there with bipolar and manic depression, and I think probably still do. And then you have wells that have high magnesium, so people would have drank the well to feel better, drank water from the well to feel better. Now again, unfortunately, with a lot of the wells, you have to be really careful where you drink them from, whether they're clean or not. But some people still bring the waters home to have in their house. Then you have things like walking around in circles. So it was called doing the rounds. Now that went back to sun worship. So it was in the direction of the sun. And it was also done in multiples of 3, 6, and 9, which again, I haven't actually quite figured out. Some people are saying it's going back to the triple goddess stories in Ireland, that you walked around in threes or 6 and 9. You also left an offering, so you can leave an offering of a coin or a medal or a flower or a shell, different things. The colour red was also important, because the colour red was to do with protecting from evil and was also to do with health. And then the tradition of the rag tree was, if somebody was sick, if you wanted to bring a piece of their clothing, you pour water on it and you hang it on the tree. Then as the cloth starts to disintegrate, the person will get better. And then a very, very old tradition, which goes way back, was about metal and throwing things into the well. And one of the traditions I read about was offerings to the gods, was you could throw in a sword or any kind of metal things could have been thrown in, and they were seen as offerings to the gods. And then with swords, they bent the swords, so if somebody took it back out, it couldn't actually be used. And then the other thing, which again was really interesting, that there were superstitions then about that you could use the well for cursing people. So if you walked around it anti-clockwise, you could put a spell on somebody or a curse. Or if somebody put a stone into the well for a curse, then you had to pay to get it back out. And then there were also sacred trees. So the most common one would have been the fairy tree, like what would be seen as the whitethorn. And a lot of wells would have whitethorns, but there are other ones like hazel and ash would also be seen as sacred. And then the pattern day probably got integrated in with the Celtic festivals. So a lot of the pattern days that were happening in July and August were probably integrated in from Lunasa festivals that would have actually gone before. And so if we're looking at offerings, you'll see there's really a mix of everything now. I mean, there's ribbons, there's crosses, there's red cloths, there's beads, there's all those different kinds of things. Now, part of the problem now is that people can sometimes leave rubbish. So we're trying to kind of encourage people to leave things that are biodegradable, or to make a plait out of rushes, or something like a stone or a shell or something that will actually be biodegradable. Now this one is one in County Sligo, so St. Tracts as well. But again, you see there's quite a mix of things in there, and you often get baby soothers. So the travellers would have a very big devotion to the wells. So if a baby is sick, they would actually bring a baby soother so the baby would get better. And sometimes children can actually be dipped into the wells as well as a blessing. Now, this is an example of what not to do, but it was basically that people hammered coins in to the tree. They thought they would get wealthy. So that's not a good one to continue. But that was in, I think, the one in Glendalough. And then this quote I found, Lady Gregory. I brought my little girl, she was interviewing a woman about cures. I brought my little girl that was not 4 years old to St. Bridget's Well on the cliffs, where she was ailing and pining away. I brought her as far as the doctors in Gort, and they could do nothing for her. And then I promised to go to St. Bridget's Well, and from that time I made the promise. She got better. And I saw the little fish when I brought her there, and she grew to be as strong a girl as ever went to America. So that was probably, I think, in the early 1900s. Now, this is the part that probably I didn't really know very much about. And when I researched it, it helped me to understand why there's a lot of confusion about the wells historically, because in Ireland, you've got the both religious influence and political influence, and both of them probably instilled fear in people. And then when the fear is just left sitting there, that also becomes the story of the well, as we saw in some of the wells that we worked with. When we started to uncover it a little bit, we also uncovered stories that probably weren't that pleasant, but by looking at them and actually healing them in some way, just by even talking about them, it also helps the people who are carrying that story in their own families. So in terms of time-wise, if we go back into the church story, Martin of Braga, 580, many demons expelled from heaven also preside in the seas and rivers and springs or forests. Men ignorant of God worship them as gods and sacrifice to them. To put bread in a spring, what is it but the worship of the devil? So this was the actual teaching. So there, Pope Gregory in 601 instructed the clergy to destroy the idols and purify the wells and build walls around them. And I know in another talk I did with Geraldine Lynch, who did she did a book about the wells in Wicklow. She had a slide which, as far as I remember, it was something like Pope Gregory had written, "Convert the Irish using their wells." So it was a way of integrating what was really important for the people and to integrate that into the new church. And then St. Augustine, lest anyone during the festivity of St. John should dare to wash himself in springs, ponds, or rivers by day or by night, since this wretched custom has remained until now from pagan times. Now the St. Augustine one was to do with England, but it would have been a similar situation in Ireland. And then in the 11th century, Saxon king, it is heathen practice if one worships idols, namely if one worships heathen gods and the sun and the moon, fire or flood, wells or stones, or any kind of forest tree, or if one practices witchcraft or encompasses death by any means, either by sacrifice or divination, or take part in such delusions. And then the Synod of Tuam, dancing, flute playing, bands of music, righteous revels and other abuses in visiting wells and other places were forbidden. You will be fined 1 shilling in penal times if you were caught visiting a well. And then this one is probably one I didn't know very much about, but I found out more really from working with the wells, because particularly Wicklow, 1798, stopped a good few of the wells, and some of the big traditions of the wells were actually stopped in 1798. And we all know the song "Who Fears to Speak" of 98. And then I remember with Colin O'Rourke's talk, where he was talking about 1798, and he was mentioning about, that it was such a shame that it wasn't, the names weren't documented or people didn't talk about it. But from what I've been reading, I can probably understand why people didn't talk about it, because some of it is pretty heavy and not very pleasant reading. And I've read some of it, but I probably stopped reading about some of the historical journals because it was a bit disturbing. But basically, from the Wells point of view, I'll give you an idea of historically how that would have influenced the fall off in visiting Wells, particularly in Wicklow. So in 1798, a gathering, two or more people was called a gathering. So if two people met anywhere, or two or more, you were arrested immediately. So if somebody went and stood at a well, or there was a pattern day, all of those things stopped because they were seen as political gatherings. And then in 1798, you had torture, you had house burnings, and you had murders. So the reason I'm talking about 1798 was one of the first wells that we decided to work on in 2013 was one called Ladies' Well on Carrick Mountain, and that is near Glenealy, Moneystown, Glenealy area. And lots of people had tried to find this well, which was on the old Neville maps in 1760, but the well was 100% gone, and there was no living memory, as none of the older people remembered the well. And usually 1849 wrote there had been a holy well in Ballyman, or Ladies' Well, Pattern Day held annually on August 15 down to 1798 would have stopped. So when we are looking for a well, with this one, all we had to work on was the old OSI historic maps, and actually it was East-West maps had marked it on it as well. So that was really all we to go on, because Geraldine Lynch, a historian who wrote Holy Wells of County Wicklow, she just had what was in the folklore archives, and it wasn't really saying very much apart from the traditions of it. So we work with Department of Folklore, the schools collection, Lean Price notebooks, Ordnance Survey, estate maps, local people, landowners, and then national monuments and culture. So in this story, this was all we had to work on, was a mark on an OSI map. But when we went there, the road is all changed because it's now a Quilcha forest. So we had no way of finding the well. I mean, it was zero. It was basically nothing. There's Tom looking for it under the trees. I mean, there's nothing, there's no landmark. And also the roads would have been totally different because there was new roads made by Quilcha. And there's Stephen actually measuring out steps, because we did actually locate the well after probably 2 or 3 attempts and nearly giving up. But how we found it was Stephen and Shane in the group could actually do water divining. So we actually found the well with divining rods, and also by counting, looking for the old boundary ditches that still existed in the middle of the trees, and we found it like that. And that scarry with the stone sign before we put it up, so that was in 2013. That's getting the cement ready. There's Danny, the dog, who has been in all our well hunting work. And then these are the stones that Shane carves, and we put them up in Irish and English, and then the info plaque that we put at each well as well. And we replanted the hawthorn tree at the well because there had been a hawthorn tree. So this well is hidden in the middle of a forest and is now back as a place that people actually go. And lots of people stop there, and there walks, there's a seat there now. But all of this happened from 2013 up to 2020. You can see there's coins left there. And then Shane has done a hand-drawn map, which is on our Facebook page. So you can see a lot of these places really, really difficult to find if you didn't have the maps. And then in 2014, we decided we would do a walk to the well, because it would have been the first one in 1798. So it would have been 216 years later. And there's a funny story with this, because I think 4 or 5 of us, we went to Moneystown thinking, okay, it'll just be us, and we'll go to the well and we'll go for coffee afterwards. And when we arrived in Moneystown, there were probably, I'd say 30 to 40 people waiting at the Moneystown Centre to go on the walk, because we had been working with local people in Moneystown. So that was a really, really nice surprise. So that was the start of what we've now been doing every year. And it's walking from Moneystown to the well and then back. And we have tea and coffee in the Moneystown Hall. And then this is me here talking about the history of the well to some of the local people. And each year we've added in more things. So we brought in music, poetry, singing, walking around the well, lots and lots of different things. And there's pupils and a teacher from Moneystown School, and they've been great because they come every year and play music. And then part of what we uncovered at this well was Margaret Connolly, a local historian, who has written a really good book called A Howl Where the Devil Ate the Tinker. I have the book here beside me. She actually had a very, very funny story in her book where she had been trying to find the well, and she'd asked the people in the forestry where the well was. They said, oh, there isn't any well, we can't find it. And then one day in 2013, somebody knocked on her door and they said, oh, the well is now there. And in her book, she says, and the well appeared as if by magic. So she didn't know who had done it, but we had actually been doing that. Now, in 1798, there were 9 people killed quite close to the well. And the first 5 names, or the first 4 names, were actually all from the one family. There was a father and 3 sons and neighbours, and they were all in a very, very small area. So at one of the well walks, we actually read out their names just as a memorial to them. Now, Frocken's Well is in Trooperstown near Glendalough, and I really don't know if this was stopped in 1798, but there's a possibility it could have been, because there was quite a lot of 1798 activity around that area. And we've put up that stone recently, and every single stone Shane carves a symbol that's actually related to the well. Tubber Owen in Ratangan, this again was linked in with 1798, where the body of a young man who was shot was actually hanged at the well for killing somebody from the local estate house. And when I asked a local woman in the village, I said, did you know anything about the well when you were growing up as a child? And she said, we were just told to not go there because it was scary, but they weren't actually told the story of what had actually happened at the well. So again, this is actually looking at a lot of the trauma that actually was there in those areas. So I think it was in 2015, we did a little event at that well as well with music, and that's the memorial to the people in 1798. And there was historians and different people at that talk as well. Now, Church Mountain, I'm conscious of the time here, so I'll go through this one quite quickly. So Church Mountain in West Wicklow, there is a well at the top of that, and there was a cairn and a church, and this is going back to Palladius, the time of Palladius, and we don't know the exact location of the well. I mean, there is a water spring area here at the side of the stone, so the well was probably there, but some old reports say that the well was inside the cairn and some say it was outside, so we don't really know, but it's a beautiful area. And then what we found out with this one was that Church Mountain was one of the 4 Lunacy Festival mountains. One is Crowpatrick, Mount Brandon, in Kerry, Slieve Donard, in County Down, and Church Mountain in Wicklow, which would have been, the only one that survived would have been Crowpatrick with the pilgrimage as a Lunacy Festival mountain, and this one ended in 1798 in Wicklow. And people, there's some reports that people were on their knees. I think for the last bit of the pilgrimage, they actually were on their knees to get to the very top. This one is Ladies' Well in Arklow, which is in the grounds of the Roundstone Quarry. Now the well is actually gone. The well is actually in the middle there where the flowers were. And the tradition of that well was that people got shells from the nearby beach, and they took water from the well to drink. This one, Bride's Well, is the most easterly well in Ireland. And this is on Bride's Head in Wicklow. That's kind of a before picture when we were trying to find the well. So I said underneath that. And this is the well now with the water is very clean with all the watercress. And we have a stone up, and it's quite near the seal colony on the beach. It's a really beautiful place. And that's a public access walk on Bride's Head. This one is the one that is under the Blessington Lakes, and this one, when the water was flooded in, I think, 1937, Bowden's well, the well went in under the water, and unfortunately that's all that is left of the part where they piped the water out and they set up an area on the lake shore for people to go to, but it got vandalized. But that's one that hopefully could be tidied up. And then this was where people visited in 1970s when the water went down and the lake rose up from the water. So I think up to 1,000 people went to visit in the 1970s. St. Kevin's Well in Glendalough. Now again, this was rediscovered in the 1980s by a local man, but going back a couple of hundred years ago, there would have been thousands of people at Pattern Days in Glendalough, and then it got stopped because of a lot of rioting and faction fights and things like that. That's St. Kevin's Well in Hollywood and St. Kevin's Well in Glastonbury. So a lot of the Kevin's Wells were on pilgrim routes to Glendalough. And in terms of pilgrimage, people walked as far as from Lough Derg to Glendalough, and they went on to Ladies Island in Wexford, and that was just walking along pilgrim routes. And we're getting close to the end now. So St. Fiach's Well in Kilkenny is very, very important, because in the barony of Shillelagh, there were only 3 holy wells, and this is the only one that is public access. So we're in the process of working on this with a stone and a sign, and that will hopefully be done soon once we can all get moving. And St. Fiach was a bard, and a poet and a bard, and it was going back to the time of Patrick, and he set up his first church at Kylebeg, which is right beside the well here. And it's a really beautiful place, and the offerings are there. And then those 2 are to do with the connection between Ireland and Wales with Moog Wells. So there was St. Aidan, which is called Mo Aog, and he was a pupil of St. David in Wales. So we're working on the one on the left at the moment, which is in a forest. And this is St. Nicholas's Well in Dunlavin, and the people in Dunlavin have done great work there because they have a path to the well, and they do regular events there with talks and different things. Ashford Well, Trinity Well in Ashford. Now again, this was one that survived until the 1920s, I think 1928, and double-decker buses would have come from Dublin, and it was like a big party really. They would have been dancing and singing, and there was one line from a local man that said, you couldn't see the dancers for the dust, which I thought was a lovely line. So they would have been dancing on the road. And that's actually a photo taken by Phil Cope, who's written the books on Wales. We brought him to Ashford. And the very last well then, which is probably one of my favourite ones, is a man called Eddie O'Neill. And Eddie and his brother have been looking after a well, which is on their land for 3 generations, and they have an event on the 15th of August, and he's here being interviewed by Johnny Dillon from the Department of Folklore, which was fantastic because he recorded him talking about the well. And that's Eddie, where on the event, he bends down and he takes the water out and he hands that to everybody who's actually at the well in August. And that's in near Ballinaclash. And I'm going to just end now with a poem, which is actually positive as well. And it's to do with, and probably very relevant for the times we're in at the moment. And it's Seamus Heaney, who spent a lot of his life in Wicklow, and I'm just reading it because he mentions healing wells. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. Call miracles self-healing, the utter self-revealing double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain or lightning and storm, and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new life at its turn.
Way to finish, Rosaleen. That's that's a really powerful image you're finishing on there. I suppose I'm shocked. I'm blown away by the work that you're doing. Like I've had some familiarity with it coming into this, but the fact that you're not only marking the sites again with these plaques, I think the plaque is a real statement of kind of longevity. It's guaranteeing that it's a living space. I think that's a really powerful message. And the fact that each is individual, you're providing something there for all of the generations. And not only the way you're bringing the children in, you're guaranteeing something here that, it's not just the fabric of the place. You really are delving into the stories of the people. And I think that's something very special. I think you deserve great credit for that. And there's a lot of comments coming in here and questions, but I'll get to in a minute. But I'm intrigued to know, we're looking at a lot in kind of in Wicklow here, but you've another 31 counties there, maybe that's the plan for the future, is it?
Well, I think now the good news is that there are people all over the country who are actually there's people doing in Cork, there's Sligo, there are people doing similar work to what we're doing all over the county. And then, so to be honest, I actually have a feeling I'll probably, if I live to be 90, I'll probably still be doing Wicklow, because it actually takes a lot of time. But also when you mentioned about the stones, is that because the stones are all hand carved by Shane O'Dree, which I'll leave his details just at the end of the talk as well. He's carving them in the stone that is also of that area, but they're also hand carved. And then the symbols on that are matching a story that matches the well. So say, for example, when I'm talking about St. Felix Well, our Shane has actually carved deer antlers because the saint had a vision where a hind came to tell him where to have his church. So that even the symbol on the stone is matching it. And then the other thing is, in terms of, we're doing this because we think it's important. We get zero funding, but we have a huge amount of goodwill. So we have people, we've got donations where people said, okay, here is the money for the stone. Say for Trooperstown Well, the person whose house beside it, he gave us the money for the stone and the sign, just handed it to me. Because otherwise we've got to do fundraising walks, because it costs about probably 300, the stone is probably about 200, 300 to actually buy the stone. And that's not anybody getting, Shane does it for free and we do all the work for free. But we have a huge amount of goodwill. And also because we're working really closely with National Monuments, they love what we're doing because we're getting permission to do every single well. We apply for permission to put up the stone, how far away it is from the things. We're working with the archaeologists to investigate. So we're not moving anything in the area, which is also a problem, because if people start doing up something without understanding the relevance of stones that beside the well are also important. So the future really is that we keep doing the work we're doing. And, I'm going to start doing guided walks, but also to include children in the walks, because I think the children are the key. Because if they don't hear about these things and they connect with it in quite a magical way, they don't understand all the probably complexities. I mean, once you bring in politics and religion, it's a minefield. Because even when I was doing the talk, I'm going, well, where do I pitch this without offending somebody? Because, I think that's the challenge.
It's like you say with the children. It's funny that you mentioned that the rag tree at the beginning, because I remember being brought to that very rag tree when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, and that's the first time I remember ever being interested in history and archaeology. It's the first thing that sprang it for me. So the fact that you're doing this again, it's guaranteeing the longevity of this. You're sowing a seed that's going to go for generations, grandkids, great grandkids. I think it's such worthwhile. And the comments that are coming in here, both privately and publicly, I'll read a few of them out to you there. We've Anna Carolina, she's saying that the first raggedy bush seemed to have been mostly socks on them, so I presume that there was a meaning behind that, like a votive in the Middle Ages. You leave something representing the part of the body that's sick. And there's some research into medieval medicine, for example, the beliefs of the ancient doctors in ancient Greece and Rome, believing that the womb was like a toad wandering in the tummy, so people would leave toad-shaped votives made of wax and wells. We have a few questions. Colm O'Rourke, which you mentioned in your lecture there, said he met you back in 2015, and he brought you to the local well in Wicklow. I'm very passionate about your interest. He thinks it's a fantastic talk, and he wants to thank you. Jeremy Ali says that it's a fantastic tribute to the forgotten people of 1798. Marie-Christine Matos said that's amazing work. Colm O'Rourke came back in again then. He said John Moore of Verthangen, it seems, was an Antrim militiaman who deserted alongside Sam McAllister and joined Dwyer. His family were publicans from that area, and he was known as Antrim John Moore, executed for being involved in the ambush and killing of William Hume of Humewood. Dominic Price said, really spirited lecture, telling of beautiful places. Thank you so much, Rosaleen. John Malloy, Rosaleen, your lecture was fabulous and most informative. Interesting overview. Daniel said, thanks. Helen says, thank you. That was really interesting. Great work. Etia said, beautiful. Thank you. Minota McGillicuddy, very uplifting. Really enjoyed the talk. Thank you so very much. Great healing places from our history. When can we get there? Take care and stay safe. Kathleen Cleary, thank you, Rosaleen. It's great work keeping our traditions alive. Eva Quinn, thank you so much. My favourite well is St. Gubnet's in Ballyvorney. Daniel said, thanks, Rosaleen, for a good presentation. It was put over, and I appreciate your words, messages, cheers. Colette Farley says, really enjoyed the lecture. Keep up the good work. And Sigfald said, thank you, Rosaleen. There's a lot of good life in what you were talking about. And we have a couple of questions. I'm going to throw one of them at you. Liam Sullivan coming in there. He says, it's fantastic lecture, Rosaleen. Were holy wells ever used as a source of water, or were they just purely exclusive religious sites?
They were purely exclusive, and it was supposed to be bad luck to actually, and there was also some story that the water wouldn't boil. So there was a lot of the wells would say they can't be used for domestic purposes.
Okay, so I suppose when we look at these in terms of, let's say, people who are tuning in tonight that are not from Wicklow or from around the country, if we come across and let's say we're aware of a well, I can think of maybe 3 or 4 in my own head that look quite overgrown and left and don't seem to be tended to. What would be the best thing that we could do in order to keep this tradition alive and to maybe start something in the locality?
Okay, well, just from our experience, and we've probably done a very good job with this, is number one, don't go onto private property without asking permission, because you're talking farmers and dogs and sheep and parking, things like that. So if it's on a public road, I would suggest asking around who's the oldest person in the area and go and talk to them and say, okay, do you know any of the traditions? So the ones that are public access are actually pretty straightforward. And then if it's a local group, you can talk to National Monuments and say you're putting up a sign. That's that bit in terms of physically cleaning them out. If they're on public, if they're public access, I don't think anybody's a problem with that. It's just not changing the structure of them. And then on private land, I think it's just really being quite sensitive to the fact they are on somebody's property. And then if they want to tidy it up and not have it as public, that's also still good, because you're still preserving it their land.
Okay, well, I have to say again, Rose, I know I've said it already, but I really have been struck by your work this evening. I really think that you've tapped into something there. When you look at these places, and especially coming from an archaeological point of view, we tend to look at them as just that, a fabric, and tend to not maybe look deeper into the area and the story and the place that's there behind these. And I think tonight you really have done a fantastic job in shedding light on those. And I think you deserve great credit and more power to you going forward. And for Trasna Tiro, we were delighted for you to come on board, because there's been a lot of people looking forward to this lecture for a long time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll just show one more slide. And actually the other thing is, if anybody, is interested in helping us or coming out with us when we can all get moving again or whatever, just contact me. There's no problem. If it's anybody's living in Wicklow and they want a day out rambling the hills of Wicklow, we're quite willing to to have other people involved. And then just the last one, I'll just put up for a minute. The Wicklow Wells Facebook is where we're documenting the wells and some of the maps for the ones I was talking about around that. Clockbrack is Shane's page with the stones. I'm going to start doing walks, which is called irishsacredwells.com, when we can all get moving again. And then my Gmail is there and the Facebook. And then Blúrini Béledges is SoundCloud from the Department of Folklore, and they're also very supportive as well, because they're helping me with recording some of the older people, which was part of the thing I was worrying about, because just to get time to do some of these things. So Johnny Dillon is now helping me with that as well. So he has one interview with Eddie O'Neill, the man I spoke about, is on that one as well on SoundCloud.
Fantastic. All work well. So you can leave that slide up there while I fly through a few things here. So from Trasnatir's point of view, any of you are still tuned in with us there on Saturday, which is tomorrow, we have Carrick, an enigmatic Anglo-Norman treasure by Dr. Dennis Shine, touted as one of the first Norman settlements in Ireland. And again, later on that night at 10 o'clock, we have a Red Shed community concert special for the World Day Peace, which is in aid of the Women's Amber Refuge. So that's on at 10 o'clock on the Zoom platform again. On Sunday, we have the Croppy Acre Memorial to the Dublin people who died in 1798 with a panel of historians, which will definitely be a very lively discussion. And moving on into Monday, we've spoken about him already tonight, the fantastic Colm O'Rourke, who we've really enjoyed his stuff so far, is coming back with the forgotten counties of the 1798 rebellion. So that's the next few nights planned out for you there, so you don't need to go anywhere. It's all there in front of you. I'd like to thank again Rosaleen for coming in tonight. This will be available on YouTube. It's been recorded, so if you want to share it and spread it around, I'm sure Rosaleen will be thrilled with the publicity, but we'll give her a big boot of us there if Liam wants to unmute everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done, Rosaleen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rosaleen. That was great. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Good.
Great lecture.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye now. Ihua.
Oh, wow.